Hello, and welcome to Hanratty on Karate. So, lately in the dojo, I've been having a little purge on basic katas. So, the other night in the dojo, I was teaching applications for the beginnings of the Heian Katas. And there's quite a number of bunkai or applications that you can use for each of these katas. And if you examine them, which I'm sure many of you have, you get to understand what's happening behind the basic movements. I know they're basic katas, and you're using these large movements that include the whole body and, all your muscles, massive movement, in an attempt to coordinate the body movements for the beginners. And so they'll include the whole body behind the technique, producing power and improving coordination. And the techniques that you can use, and I'm sure everyone, has thought, okay, what can I use this for? And generally when I'm teaching applications, I break it down into 3 scenarios. I will show an application for the kata as it's performed in its basic stance. We'll do it from a freestyle fighting position, and then we'll do it also from a street style position where, you may be in an unwanted confrontation, not a mutually agreed type of confrontation, which would be, sparring or in the dojo. Anyway, at the end of the class, everyone enjoyed it, by the way, and got a lot out of it, and getting caught up into it, I never got much further than Heian Sandan, and I was only teaching the beginning moves of each kata, or, the signature moves, if you like, on some of them. Like there's certain katas I always look at, and they've got signature moves, and this move has to be spot on if you're teaching it right. Anyway, at the end of class, a couple of students come over, they were talking in the corner, come over, Sensei, can I ask you a question? I said, sure, that's what I'm here for, What they wanted to know was why they were called Heian Katas. Now, I know most of you are listening have got a great interest in karate and probably know where the name, the Heian Katas, come from. And so I explained to them that the Heian Katas come from original Okinawan Pinan Katas, which were developed by Anko Toso. And he developed them because he was a school teacher. He was in Okinawan Middle School, which is now Shuri High School in Shuri in Okinawa. And the name comes from the Chinese, Pinan, which means safe and peaceful. And that's what you'd want to teach kids. You wouldn't want to teach them something that's going to teach rambunctious 10-year-olds how to rip somebody's face off. So he made the katas safe and peaceful. And they were developed from some earlier katas, mostly Chanan, which I have tried to find a version of Chanan that I can recognize, but there isn't one. There's some people's idea of Chanan, but basically it's been lost in the mists. Now, some of these people say it could be Shirikomi, which is white bear kata. It's also known as Tenno kata. So it's very basic. There's no kicks in it. It's just, it's kind of like Heian Shodan. There's no kicks involved in it, and the Emberson is very similar and quite basic. They would have developed 1 or 2 of the Pinan katas from that, but I think you would have had to go much deeper to get the full repertoire of the Pinan katas. You'd have to go into a few other katas, which is why I was so keen to try and find any replication or any versions of Chanan, which I couldn't do. But when you look at the Heian or the Pinans, they're quite a full kata. They're quite rich in technique and application, and each one teaches you something a little different. So the Pinan katas developed to be peaceful and safe and taught to kids. And they're taught to kids in large movements to exercise the body, get the muscles working, and basically to help develop the kids' bodies and fitness. And when Funakoshi brought them over to Japan, after Okinawa was integrated in Japan, and they kind of took it all over, like the Satsuma clan, basically it was part of their domain, if you like, and then during the period when it was taken over by Japan, the Satsuma clan were paid, for what they'd lose in taxation and stuff like that. But it'd been their domain from, maybe about 1600 something. And that was just part of the fiefdom, if you like. Like most of the daimyos had their areas that they controlled. And that was under the basically the Nara period, just before the Edo period. So in the Edo period come along, there was a big move to nationalize Japan rather than it being all these broken up little pieces. So you ended up getting the shogun, who basically was the governing body, and we had the emperor, who was the titular head of the royalty, but had nothing to do with the government, kind of like the British royalty, supposed to have nothing to do with the government. And the Tokugawa clan eventually took over during the Edo period. First it was Taiko and then Nobunaga, and it kind of moved on until, if you watch the series on TV, you kind of get a rough idea of how Tokugawa took over the shogunate. And there was successions of the Tokugawa clan that carried on the shogunate through the Edo period, and through the Heian period, Edo, and then Heian period, which was supposed to be the peaceful period. And I honestly believe this is where Funakoshi took the name, because the Heian period was supposed to be peaceful, and it was for the most part, because Japan was slowly becoming nationalized, and the shoguns ruled by edict rather than by legality. Nobody gets a vote on it. They were all proclamations and orders, and they were carried out. And they had various ways of ensuring that the different daimyos who controlled all these different areas were under the control of the government. And one of the ways they did that was they had a governing body that carried out their orders called Bakufu. And the Bakufu was kind of like an administrative part of the government. They didn't have a police force as such, but they had these guys. And basically they were between the emperor and the the shogunate. And so they kind of held the power of the emperor, and they carried out the will of the shogunate. So everything would run smooth. So the first thing we go back on, and we're looking at, say, the beginning of karate, or Todei, or Okinawa Tei, or whatever you want to call it. It runs back to about the 14th century, when the Ryukyu Islands, the Ryukyu group, they kind of got brought together under a king, King Shoshin, and that carried on, even though the Satsuma clan laid claim to the Okinawa group, the Ryukyu Islands. They allowed the king to rule there as well. And what you had, first of all, was a weapons ban by the king. I'm not sure if this was ordered by the Satsuma clan or it just come in place by the king because he didn't like people having weapons. And this is not unusual. It was the same in Japan. It wasn't just samurai who carried swords, and although that's the myth that we get. Eventually it was. They were allowed to carry two swords. They were allowed to carry them in public, okay? But after several bans, and these came under quite a few of the different shoguns, Nobunaga was one of the first, and he instituted what was called the Great Sword Hunt. And this is on the Japan mainland. He instituted what's called the Great Sword Hunt, and he got people to give up the swords and their archery implements, their bows, and long spears and stuff. He said it was to go towards melting down and creating this great big bronze Buddha. And so people did that, and they were kind of given blessings for it, or rewards or whatever. But it was earlier in Okinawa that we had a weapons ban, and this was done by the king. And so a lot of people are of the opinion that this led to the development of open hand techniques, because there wasn't much by the way of police force to settle any disputes you had, say, between farmers or just neighbours, whatever. Pretty violent, pretty barbaric, the same as the rest of the world. You didn't go looking for a policeman because there was no such thing. You settled any kind of dispute you had on your own. Unless it affected the government, they weren't really interested. They were interested in people carving people up with swords, and which is why you had the successive sword bans. Of course, the biggest one that we're all aware of came during the Meiji period, when they wanted to get rid of the samurai altogether. And if you watched the movie The Last Samurai. Great movie, not entirely true, but a little bit true, just enough to get you interested. There was a rebellion, but basically one of the main sword bands came after the Battle of Sekigahara, which was shogun at the Tokugawa shogun that beat the main defenders. He didn't just wipe them out, though. He brought them back into the fold, but he did want to ban the use of weapons. And he wanted to ban the use of weapons not just for the clans that he defeated, and he banned them for the peasants and the merchants. They were the ones who had to give all their swords up. And Japan was a great sword-making country. One of their main exports all through these times to China and everywhere else was weapons, swords, because they did make very, very good swords, which is how the best craftsmen came to the top. You didn't just have a couple of guys who were very, very good at sword making. You had thousands of people who were making swords. A couple of them were really, really good and came to be and still are probably national treasures in Japan. And so are some of the swords dating back to the 12th and 13th century. But they didn't export those ones. They kept them. But they did export weapons and silks and silver. Silver was the main export to Japan. In fact, in one point, it was known as the Silver Islands. So this was what Japan had going for it. So people think, oh, just a feudal society, nothing happening outside. They were, in fact, quite international in their own little part of the world. They traded with the Philippines, they traded with China, Korea, Macau, Portuguese China, and which is how the Portuguese got into Japan rather, and opened up little trading posts. Of course, they got closed down every now and again until probably the 1860s when the states, being the United States, went in there with gunships and demanded that they open it up. But it was the Portuguese who introduced muskets and stuff to Japan, and Tokugawa used these to great success in the Sekigahara War. Up until then, battles would be like a one-on-one thing. You'd get one samurai from one tribe come out, shout insults at the other guy. Two people would battle it off, and then, you get like a bar brawl. But it was basically one-on-one until you got muskets and you got trained regiments, and Tokugawa was one of the first to use those. But anyway, to get back to the kata, Funakoshi decided to call his katas Heian Katas, and they're pretty much based on the Pinan katas. You just change the numbers around. They do Pinan Nidan for the very basic kata, and Funakoshi did Heian Shodan for his basic kata. Now, Heian means the peaceful period, as I said, and it's one of the periods in Japan basically split up into all these different periods. And Heian's supposed to be peaceful. It wasn't that peaceful, especially towards the end when you got these little wars. And then right after the Heian period, you got the Kamakura period, which was quite bloody. And everybody just wanted an end to all these wars. And the Tokugawa shogunate, they were the ones to bring that about. And they formed this administrative body, Bakufu, and they were the administrative part. And they provided a system where they made it very hard for the different daimyos or feudal lords to kind of build up their little armies and become any kind of revolutionary force. And they did this by stating that they had to spend 6 months of the year in Edo, which is now Tokyo, which they made their capital. It's up on the Kanto Plain. And Kyoto was the imperial capital where the emperor stayed. Kyoto was originally called Heian-kyo, which was the original name of Kyoto, which means peaceful city, believe it or not. And I think probably this is where the name Heian come from for the Heian period. And so everything kind of goes back, becomes convoluted and mixed up. But anyway, that was Kyoto. Heian-kyo to start with, his original name, changed to Kyoto when they moved the imperial palace there from Nara, which is in the Nara period. So, as I say, the Tokugawa shogunate line, they were through the Heian and into the Kamakura period in Japan. All of these eras basically have names right up till the Meiji period, and there was two in between the Kamakura and the Meiji. Meiji kind of brought Japan into modern times, and they did it very well, because most countries that were like medieval feudal systems were taken over by the industrialized West, because Japan and just about all of the countries that were colonized by either the Dutch or the French or the English were taken over because the Europeans had the much better technology. However, Japan was able to skirt its way around that and remain kind of independent while at the same time taking advantage of it. And then they kind of come to realize, hey, we have to be industrial as well. They went about it in a big way, but they still managed to keep their own little culture and independence. And there's lots of little individual stories in between times of all these eras, like how Buddhism became very big and how the shogunate actually wanted to take the weapons from the big Buddhist temples that kind of followed the Chinese model, where they kept basically an army of fighting monks or fighting priests. So this was another reason for having these great sword hunts and weapons bans, not just to keep the peasants down in case of revolt, but also to keep the religious side down. And they had quite a few religious upbringings. There was a big ban on Christianity by one of the Tokugawa shoguns, and he ordered them all out of the country because they were just interfering and meddling and trying to bring the European standards into Japan, and Japan wanted to keep its own cultural personality, if you like, and you can't blame them. This is the way things are. But anyway, that was all came about because somebody asked me, why do we say Heian Shodan or bombs? So originally it was peaceful and safe when Itosu formed the Heian Katas because he was teaching them to kids. And Funakoshi also taught in the school there. And then when he came over to Japan, he called them Heian Katas. And that was because the Heian period, which was named after Kyoto, which was Kyoto-kyo, which was peaceful, safe city. The Heian period was supposed to be nice and peaceful as anything can be in Japan. And then, of course, we go on through the other different periods. So all very interesting, and there's a wealth and a depth of knowledge and reading out there if you're interested in it. I have quite a few Japanese history books, and I just love it because just the way of thinking and the art and everything else, and even the way of writing, the kana script that they have was developed during the Heian period, and one of the first novels ever written in the world was Tales of Genji, which was written in the kana script, not in kanji, which is basically Chinese. So I say Chinese, I've always said this, Japanese are amazing imitators, but they imitate to perfection, according to them, right? And it very often works. And they're more interested in the beauty of taking something, and their imitation or their production of it becomes a lot more aesthetic, if you like, in their eyes. And this is the way they feel about everything. Their karate, the flower arrangements, the tea ceremony, the Zen mastery of art, and I can go into Zen a lot as well because it runs throughout the whole of their society. It's all integrated in a kind of marvelous way to get the culture that you see now when you go to Japan. And I know lots of karate people have gone to Japan and they just love the culture because it's considerate, if you like. It's very considerate of your neighbour, your fellow man, how to keep things clean, not littering anywhere, not eating in the streets, all of these little things that show how civilized we can become if we try. Anyway, that's enough from me for this time. So take care and we'll talk to you again. Bye now.